The Panthers' defensive line struggled mightily without Derrick Brown in 2024. Brown back. Can they get back to being a strength on the roster? I'll tell you right here on Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, the part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday as we continue into off-season mode here on the show. But in a couple weeks, we're back to Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, and being your team every day, which is our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for watching the show right here on YouTube and listening wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. There's no mailbag, but you can still at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council, or at me over on Blue Sky. And of course, follow me there on Twitter and Blue Sky at Julian Council with any questions that you have about your Panthers leading up to training camp. Today's episode of Locked On Panthers is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Taking a look at Carolina Panthers defensive line heading into 2025. And last year, it was a rough one. And a rough one mainly because Derrick Brown missed the vast majority of the season. And even in the one game he played, he tore his meniscus. And I'm not sure how compromised he was in that game. I believe after it, the report, at least from Dave Canales, Panthers head coach, was that Derrick's knees kind of swelled up on him after the plane flight back to Charlotte. And then they did a nice MRI and found out, yeah, it's the meniscus, and he's going to have surgery and be out for the rest of the season. So no idea what the deal was with him in the middle of that Saints game, but he did not grade out well at all. He was the fourth lowest graded defender in that game with a 47.7, which is not Derrick Brown. Had the worst tackling grade at 26.7. And I have to imagine, I didn't go back and look at this, but I feel pretty confident saying those were the worst grades of Derrick Brown's career as a Carolina Panther, and not at all the kind of player that Carolina is expecting to have this season, expecting to have the majority of last season had he played, and expecting to never see again. That was just a bad performance by him in the entirety of the defensive line. And without Derrick Brown last season here in Carolina, it was, to be frank, the worst defensive line in this organization's history. This defense overall gave up the most points in the history of the Panthers organization and history of the National Football League, scoring points-wise, horrible. And then also you look at it, rushing defense allowed 3,000-plus yards on the ground. That does not happen if Derrick Brown is healthy throughout the entirety of last season, both with the amount of rushing yardage allowed and the amount of points given up. And I do understand that not every single one of those points was allowed by the defense. There was also a pick six in there, some other issues that are attributed mainly to the offense and special teams, but it goes to the defense, goes to the Panthers as a whole as far as points that they allowed. So really for me, heading into this year, looking at the defensive line, like the biggest storyline to me is, can Derrick Brown stay healthy and return to Pro Bowl form? And coming off of an injury like a meniscus, not nearly as serious as a torn ACL or possibly even a broken leg or even an Achilles and all of that. And maybe it's worse than a broken leg, but it's meniscus. We've seen guys bounce back and play fine off of those. We saw Austin Corbett, who struggled the year prior coming back from an ACL. He came back last year off of meniscus, and I thought he played fine in those 4.5 games that he played before going out with another season-ending injury in that loss up in Chicago. And I would expect the same with Derrick Brown, that he would come back and that he could play at the level that we saw back in 2023 when he was like all world, was setting NFL records. And looking back at that 2023 season, Derrick Brown crossed the 100 tackle threshold with 103 tackles. That set the NFL record for the most tackles by a defensive lineman in a single season. Now, understand this, the NFL had not been tracking this stat very long. It goes all the way back to 1994. So I'm older than the NFL's not ability, but want to go out there to track the amount of tackles that a defensive lineman has in a single season. So that goes all the way back to 1994, looking at his PFF grades, a 90.1. 4th out of 130 qualifying defensive tackles in that season. Run defense grade elite, 90 on the dot. That was 2nd out of 137 defensive tackles who qualified. Then pass rushing grade, I know there's a lot of angst early on in Derrick's career, especially in 2020 during the pandemic season, which all the angst that y'all had during that year was ridiculous, in my opinion. Just be happy you have football instead of complaining about every little thing that year, which, hey, that's what we do as football fans. So I kind of appreciated it while also rolled my eyes and wondered, why can't we just be happy that it's actually happening after all we had gone through that year? But his pass rush grade is 78.1, 18th out of 109 defensive linemen going back to 2023. And Todd Wash, who's back for his 3rd season as the defensive line coach here in Carolina. He talked about when he first got here to Carolina a couple of off seasons ago that he wanted to really grow Derrick Brown's ability to get after the passer. Not necessarily something he did back in college at Auburn, even though he was a menace on that defense back in 2019, and a defense that was the only one that really slowed down that LSU team that had Joe Burrow, that also had Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson. You might have heard of all those guys making a ton of money and some of the best players in the National Football League at this point in time. He had 2 sacks that season, by the way, 27 hurries, 12 quarterback hits, and 41 pressures going back to 2023. And the Panthers rewarded Derrick Brown, unlike they had with a guy like Brian Burns. They decided to trade him earlier the month, where they decided to then hand Derrick a 4-year, $96 million extension with $63 million in guarantees that was going to kick in this season and is kicking in this season. He became instantly that day one of the cornerstones of the Panthers defense, one of the cornerstones just of the Carolina Panthers organization moving forward into this Dave Canales and Dan Morgan era. And I'm really hoping, for Derrick's sake, for the Panthers' sake, for your sake, hell, my sake, that he can be the guy he was a couple of years ago. And it's certainly possible, because he is coming off of a serious knee injury that cost him the majority of last season, that it takes some time, maybe midway through the year, he gets back to the old Derrick Brown, and maybe it's not until 2026 he gets back to the old Derrick Brown. But I'm really hopeful. And just because it's a meniscus, and I know it's more of a rupture or whatever that caused him to have the surgery that had them to do the whole reconstruction where he had to miss the entirety of the season. There's been times where you have a meniscus tear and you can come back in a month or two. That was not the case, of course, last year for Derrick. But I'm just thinking, because it's a meniscus, it's not an ACL, it's not an Achilles, and some of the more serious injuries that you could suffer in your knee and just in your lower half of your body, that he can come back, be ready to go. Now, he did say when speaking to the media prior to the close of mandatory minicamp earlier this month, or I guess actually last month in June, that he's hopeful to be ready to go for training camp, and that likely going to be some load management there. For me, if he is able to be just full steam ahead for the joint practices against the Browns, against the Texans in those first 2 weeks, I'm good there. Don't necessarily need to see him in the preseason coming off of an injury. But if he's able to be a participant, not just in individual drills, but in team drills, there for joint practices with those two teams, and if they want to play him a snap or two, or series or two, whatever it's going to be against Pittsburgh, I suppose that's cool. But, man, as long as Derrick Brown is good to go, is in good shape, feeling confident about that knee come week 1 down in Jacksonville, like, that's the best case scenario for the Panthers are standing. As the big storyline with this group is just, can Derrick Brown come back healthy? And if so, can he be the guy he was in 2023 and get back to their Pro Bowl form? If that's the case, this is going to be a dramatically improved defensive front. There's no way they go back to giving up 3,000 plus yards on the ground and being the worst scoring defense in the history of the NFL for a second year in a row. Derrick Brown is a massive key to not just the Panthers' interior defensive line, but to the Panthers' defense and the Panthers' ability to contend in the NFC South and get to the playoffs this upcoming season here in 2025. And it's not just Derrick Brown. The Panthers had to add pieces behind Derrick Brown, next to Derrick Brown, around Derrick Brown, and they did that on the first day of the legal negotiating period, signing Bobby Brown III and Turk Wharton. Much like last season, can they get 2 interior guys to come in and live up to their deals and turn this organization around? We'll talk about that here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little bit more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. I've been using FanDuel to track my favorite matchups, and the app keeps it fresh with new daily promotions and fun ways to bet. It's easy to use, fast to pay out, makes even regular season games feel like must-watch events. Whether I'm placing a same-game parlay or watching a bet ride into the ninth inning, FanDuel makes it feel like I'm a part of the action. New to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 to get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Going back to last offseason, Carolina had to do everything in their power to help Bryce Young. And one of the big ways to do that was by spending big money on the first day of the legal negotiating period, signing Robert Hunt to a $100 million contract, and then later that evening signing Damian Lewis to a $63 million contract, $163 million right there for your left and right guards together to try to fix the interior of the offensive line, which was a massive problem in 2023 during that 2-15 embarrassment of a season. We understand 7 different left guards, 8 different right guards. That stopped as Robert Hunt played 16 games. Damian Lewis played 16 games, and both of those guys lived up to what the Panthers expected out of them, was to come in, solidify their spots, and play at a high level, and to keep the quarterback clean. And that happened last year with Robert and with Damian. Now, fast forward to this offseason and maybe backtrack a couple of months ago, and the Panthers needed to do a lot to fix the defense, and not necessarily to help one singular player, but to help an entire unit get back to what the standard has been here for 30-plus seasons in Carolina. And last year, that was not the standard. That was beyond an embarrassment. It was a mockery of what Carolina Panthers defensive football has been here in Carolina. And what they decided to do this time around on the first day of the legal negotiating period was to spend big money on 2 interior defensive linemen in Bobby Brown III and Turk Wharton, coming from LA and Kansas City, respectively. And now the question, as it pertains to those guys, like last year, can they live up to what Carolina is asking them to do? Robert Hunt and Damian Lewis did it, and now there is no concern about the interior of the offensive line heading into this year. The only question is who's going to start at center, and it doesn't really matter in my opinion, because I think whoever comes in, whether it be Cade Mays or Austin Corbett, will play really well next to those 2 studs at right guard and left guard, respectively, in Hunt and Lewis. And it's going to be important, obviously, to have Derrick Brown back and healthy. And if you have him back and healthy and you have Bobby Brown III and Turk Wharton among the rotation next to him, that is a great situation for Carolina to be in, as long as Wharton and Brown play up to their contracts and do exactly what Carolina asked them to do. We cannot forget the way Carolina got here is they were trying to spend a bunch of money on Milton Williams. That became a bidding war where the Panthers ended up not being able to get him. It was $104 million that New England ended up spending, which is more per year than what the Panthers are paying Derrick Brown. I don't know how you can justify paying Milton Williams, who has never been a Pro Bowler, has never played the amount of snaps in a single season that Derrick Brown has played, more money than Derrick Brown, even if Derrick's coming off of injury. And I don't think there's any question about who Derrick's going to be coming off of the injury in the future. Maybe this season there might be a little bit of a setback as he gets back to who he was, but certainly long-term, he will be the guy he was back in 2023 when the last time he was healthy. But looking at these 2 guys, Bobby Brown III and Turk Wharton, with Bobby, it might be for Carolina the biggest defensive signing that they've made. And we'll talk more about these guys over the next week or so as we look at every single position group on the rosters. There's draft picks that you can look at and think that those are big moves. But as far as just pure signings for the Panthers, I'm having a hard time looking at any other one. Maybe in the secondary with Trevon Merrick. We'll talk about him later on. Maybe he's the biggest one. But to me, Bobby Brown coming in after he played 49 games with the Rams, 30 of them he started, and he played 17 last year, starting 16, and they had 44 tackles, 4.0 TFLs, PFF grade 61.3, 47th out of 118 interior defensive linemen who qualified. The big one for me, though, is run defense grade. 65.6. That's 21st out of 140. The Panthers really struggled when it was like LeBron Ray in there. Ashawn Robinson was the best among a bad group of defensive linemen. You had Nick Thurman who struggled. You had Shai Tuttle who struggled. Deshaun Williams, everybody who went in there last year just did not play up to the standard that has been set here in the past when it comes to those interior defensive linemen. Yeah, wearing the black and blue here in Carolina. So him coming in, and it's not like the Panthers spent a ton of money to bring in Bobby Brown. As I'm looking to pull up his contract here, as they signed him to, let's see. Oh, I can't find it. As they signed him to I think a 3-year deal. Here it is. They signed Bobby Brown III to a 3-year $21 million deal that can go up to $27 million in incentives if he hits those. And I would think that he's going to have a good chance to do so. He worked with outside linebacker coach AC Carter, who's coming over from LA. And again, he's known to be an excellent run stopper, which is what Carolina absolutely needs him to do this year next to Derrick. And if Derrick gets back to being an elite run stopper with that 90 grade, and then you see maybe Bobby take a step forward, maybe get closer to the 70 grade, like you're going to have a pretty stout interior defensive line this upcoming season if both those guys play to their ability, and especially Derrick Brown gets back to who he was. But Bobby Brown is even better next to a player of Brown's caliber. And then with Turk Wharton, I think there's questions about how much Carolina spent. It's 3 years, $45 million up to $54 million max. And we talked to Chris Clark of Locked On Chiefs back in May, whether he was surprised about that number. And he said he was, because it wasn't like Turk Wharton was the guy in KC. We obviously know that Chris Jones is the dude there. They're paying him a ton of money, but Turk played really well next to one of the elite defensive linemen in the league. And now you have another elite defensive lineman in the league, maybe not somebody who's quite a pass rusher as Chris Jones as far as getting home and numbers-wise, sack totals go. Well, you have a great player in Derrick Brown. And look, he played 72 games KC with 13 starts, including 10 last year. He had 29 tackles, 7 tackles for loss, at a career-high 6.5 sacks. You want to count the postseason. He had 8.5 sacks, which led Kansas City last year as a loss in the Super Bowl to Philadelphia's PFF grade 60.8. That was 49th out of 118 defensive linemen. Run defense grade, not great, which is okay, because you would think on some of the obvious run defense downs, you're going to want to have Derrick out there. You're going to want to have Bobby Brown the third out there, maybe Ashawn Robinson, depending on how things play out. Cam Jackson, who they just drafted in the 5th round out of Florida, possibly Shai Tuttle. Like, you're going to try to bring in some heavier guys to help you out there on those spots, but really his value comes with the pass rush. 71.9 pass rush grade, 21st. And again, we'll talk about it. 8.5 sacks last year, if you count the postseason, those 2 sacks he had on the Chiefs run to the Super Bowl, 42 pressures and 514 pass rush snaps. You get 2 guys who bring 2 different qualities about them. One in Bobby Brown III, who's going to be a solid run stopper, and in one Turk Wharton, who's going to give you that interior pass rush, which is not like Carolina's had that over the last couple of years, even with Derrick Brown having solid pass rush numbers as far as his pressure rate was in 2023. He's never come close to that kind of total sack-wise, and now you get that from Turk. So getting both of those guys is massive. And you had several defensive linemen last year who were grading out in the 30s and 40s, according to Pro Football Focus. So now you got 2 guys who are top 50 among qualifiers when you look at interior defensive linemen from a season ago. And you go back to the Milton Williams thing, $104 million that you would have had to spend on Milton Williams potentially, if that's what Carolina would have had to come to terms to get Milton Williams over New England. The Panthers end up spending a maximum of $81 million on Bobby Brown and Turk Wharton, and that would save them $23 million if you just base that off of the $104 million that Milton Williams potentially can get at the end of the day. I mean, they save $35 million if Brown and Wharton don't hit on their incentives. Of course, you want them to hit on their incentives, but if they don't pan out, sure, you may have lost out on a better player who might have helped you more. But you didn't overpay. It depends on how it plays out, obviously. But still, they were able to get 2 guys with 2 valuable traits, one in run stopping, one in pass rush, for less than they had to pay to get one player who certainly would have been very questionable in terms of his ability to stop the run, that being in Milton Williams. And I don't necessarily believe it's a stretch to say that this upcoming season could be dependent upon how these 2 signings perform. You go back to last year, you were able to get consistency and quality out of your two interior offensive linemen in Robert Hunt and in Damian Lewis. If you're going to be able to get consistency and quality out of both of these guys, in Turk and in Bobby, then I think this defense could be a lot better. Obviously, it would be a lot better than it was last year. And a defense is only as good as its interior and what it is up the middle. If you're bad up the middle, you're just not going to be able to win games. If you can't stop the run, and J.C. Horn told you, I don't have to say this to you, someone who plays out there every single week told y'all last year that if you can't stop the run, you can't stop anything. And now with these guys coming in, primarily Bobby, when it comes to run stopping, that gives the Panthers a chance. Because if these guys don't perform, then they're not going to have a chance to take significant strides from what they were last year defensively. So very important that both these signings pan out, much like the signings last year on the interior of the offensive line, and that could change everything for this Panthers defense heading into 2025, plus the addition of Derrick Brown getting back to who he was in 2023. So how many guys are going to make the roster? Going to be a serious camp battle here on a defensive line. We'll talk about that here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. Projecting the 53-man roster as it pertains to the defensive line group, in particular the interior of the defensive line for your Carolina Panthers. Last year, the Panthers kept 7 defensive linemen initially, but Jaden Crumedy, who had an ankle injury during training camp, was immediately placed on IR. Did not see him until the final 5 weeks of the season. Jaden Peavy did not stick around long, so they had about 5 or 6 guys throughout the season. Now, looking at it, I have tiers, guaranteed roster spot, roster bubble, and then I have practice squad options / UFL bound. The guys who are guaranteed to make the roster, in my opinion, I mean, Derrick Brown, he's not going anywhere. Bobby Brown III, just signed him. He's not going anywhere. Turk Wharton, those guys are obviously on the roster. A'Shawn Robinson, who was the best among a terrible group of interior defensive linemen, and that's nothing to say bad about him. I think he's a solid guy. And the fact that obviously he came over last year because he had been in this scheme before, his ties with Jero Rivero, I do not anticipate him not being on the roster this season. So those 4 guys, they're good. And now looking at it, it could be somewhere in between 5 guys battling for 3 spots, 5 guys battling for 2 spots. I don't think it's going to be 5 battling for 1. I do think they're going to keep probably 6, maybe 7. But looking at it, the 5 guys who would be battling for the final spots on the initial 53 at the defensive line position, Cam Jackson, the 5th-round pick from Florida, he would be one of them. I wanted to put him as guaranteed, but when you're a 5th-round pick, can't guarantee any of that. Now, last year, they kept every single one of their draft picks that they did not trade. That was, of course, Michael Barrett, who got traded, the 7th-rounder from Michigan, got traded to Seattle for the services of one Mike Jackson here in Carolina, which worked out to be one of the better moves the Panthers made last year. Maybe one of the better moves that Dan Morgan has made so far in his year and a half as the Panthers general manager and president of football operations. But Cam Jackson, I would think that he's probably going to be good as long as he shows you something. He'll be solid, and he's going to be somebody they're going to expect to be more of a run stopper more than anything, and that is a quality that they absolutely need. So having him in there, that would make sense. So he's somebody battling. Shai Tuttle, it's going to be a tough one for Shai. He signed a revised 1-year contract this offseason with the Panthers that's worth $3 million with an additional $3.5 million available through incentives. So he was set to make $6.5 million this year. But Carolina looked at it. It's like, look, Shai, I know we've asked you to do a lot these first 2 years, play more than you probably should have, but you have not shown us a ton. So instead of cutting him, they offered him a pay cut. He took it. So they cut $3 million away from his roster, gave him only $500K in guaranteed, and he can make up all that money back if he's able to hit incentives, which I doubt will be the case, because that would also not be a good situation because they would be a lot of injuries, but also would mean that he would play well. So kind of a double-edged sword there as far as that goes. Now, it would have saved Carolina $3.2 million had they cut him. Now, they did save some money by doing the whole more pay cut situation with Shai Tuttle. His grades last year, PFF wise, were not good. 42.7. That was 108, 118 interior defensive lineman. Run defense grade 33.5, 134th out of 140 who qualified. Pass rush grade, not super important with him, but 51.4. That was 88 out of 97. So near the bottom in all of those statistics. And he wasn't great the year prior. His PFF grade was 52.9. So he got worse from 23 to 24. And if they did decide to cut him, they would lose $825,000 against the salary cap. So I don't know if Carolina's trying to lose nearly $1 million when it comes to the cap, but if it comes down to not guaranteeing him $500K, which is not a lot of money, and that's one of the things with the vested veterans, you don't want to guarantee their salaries. I don't think guaranteeing Shy Tuttle $500,000 is that big of a deal. I think it's more of a big deal for them to decide to cut him and then lose more money against salary cap than that they would be losing by just paying him this year. So we'll see. He's got to earn it, though, because there's some young guys who are going to try and take a spot. And one of those guys, second-year player, 6th-round pick from a year ago from Mississippi State, Jaden Crumity. Again, missed majority of last season on IR with that ankle injury. Pretty much we're just like redshirting him. Had a pretty long ramp-up period, 21 days they can do that for as far as being assigned a return from injured reserve. He turns 25 at the end of next month on the 30th. Only played in 121 snaps in 5 games last season. And when he played, didn't show a ton. 42.5 PFF grade. If you take away the snap minimum, there's 191st out of 219 interior defensive linemen last year. So not good. Understandable for a rookie who was injured throughout training camp in the majority of the season to not go out there and to show a ton, especially when you had veteran guys not showing a ton without Derrick Brown out there. So why would you expect him to play better than them at points in times? So he's going to be battling for a spot. LeBron Ray, he's back also. And he's a guy who also struggled. PFF grade of 33 on the dot last year. That was dead last among qualifying interior defensive linemen. So 118th out of 118. If you take away the snap minimum, he was 212 out of 219. Hard to believe LeBron Ray's going to be back on the roster this season with some of the additions that they've made, but we will see. And then Jared Harrison Hunt is another one to look at. Started off his career at Miami, but then transferred to SMU last season and had a nice year. He had 42 combined tackles, 6.5 sacks. So the pass rush ability, that's something that could separate him, but it's really and always going to come down for guys like him to special teams and how he can contribute there. But he did show some things without the pads on. Understand that throughout the spring during OTA's mandatory minicamp. So a name to know as it pertains to 5 guys battling for 2 or 3 spots at the back end of the roster there as far as defensive line goes. And the final guy, Sam Roberts, was on the roster a couple of times last year, practice squad guy. I think he's probably bound for the practice squad again or bound for the UFL. That's how I'm breaking it down when it comes to the Carolina Panthers interior defensive line group. But it's going to wrap up this edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, part of Locked On Podcast Network, hosted by yours truly, Julian Council. Again, y'all subscribe or follow the show for free over on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter and Blue Sky at Julian Council. The mailbag is not back yet, but it'll be back soon enough. So either at me or DM me with any questions you have, and I can try always to get back to you when I have time. In the meantime, be safe, be happy, be whole. As always, keep pounding, and we're back on the 4th of July. Happy birthday, America. Breaking down the edge rushers, a very intriguing group with 2 young guys who are going to have a lot of expectations placed on them as rookies this season in Carolina.